paralyzed billionaire crushed his staff until a single mother whispered 3 words and broke him. In this adaptation, Dandara is a single mother. He fired them like doors closed behind tired shoes. 3 women in 3 mornings, cardboard boxes, a hasty signature on a sheet of paper. The mansion kept its marble cool under their steps, as if the stone could swallow noise and grief the way it swallowed light. A gold doorknob turned. A head of hair bowed. A small drawing, folded at the corner, left on a counter. There is a rhythm to cruelty when it is practiced as a routine. Orders given at 10, expectations impossible by noon. Mistakes met with an iciness that sat in the corridors like a smell of antiseptic. Henrique Costa's house ran on precision. People were tools to be sharpened or discarded. He kept hours in his wristwatch and distance in his eyes. He had money to make the world look like glass. He had a body that reminded him every day that glass could also shatter. Dandara noticed these things faster than most. She had learned to read the world in small signs. The way a hand tightened on a railing. The way the kitchen light hummed when a contract arrived. She learned to hold her breath until it counted. In her bag was a crumpled postcard drawn by a 5-year-old who had made a son that looked like a hopeful coin. Her daughter Leela's handwriting, wobbly letters that read "Mama" in purple marker, was taped to the inside of Dandara's wallet. At night, when the city outside their apartment hummed and the refrigerator made the same tired noises, Dandara would touch the paper and repeat the times. Medicine at 8, rent at 12, school money by Monday. She was good at schedules. She was better at holding. On the morning she arrived at the mansion, her shoes were wet from a sudden rain. Roberto, the driver with more patience than he let on, opened the gate and didn't comment. The house smelled of polished wood and lemon cleaner, and of perfume that had cost more than a month's wages. Cristina watched from the corridor like a hawk with a grievance. Dona Gloria, the head housekeeper, gray hair knotted into a bun and hands with stories written in calluses, gave Dandara a small nod, as if to say, "Welcome, if it must be." The portrait-lined hall made promises Dandara did not own. She breathed and walked in anyway. Henrique was in the library, where books were arranged not by theme, but by a private logic only he honored. He sat in a bespoke wheelchair that looked like a throne at war with its occupant. He had not always been unapproachable. That was a rumor the house kept alive in photographs. A photo of a smile and a woman whose absence had been larger than any handshake. Now he invited interviews on his terms. He assigned tasks that had the tone of a test and the cruelty of a riddle whose answer was humiliation. "Can you alphabetize 462 books by 1 this afternoon?" "Huh," he asked, not surprised that she blinked. His voice was steady, like a metronome, and it intended to mark fault. "No," Dandara would have said if the room were hers. Instead, she bowed, not because she believed humiliation was proper, but because she had bills that did not forgive opinions. "I will try," she said. Short sentences that folded into work. The first days were a gauntlet. Dandara moved like a person who had learned to be invisible and then practiced being graceful in the gaps. She folded linen so edges lay like small, perfect secrets. She scrubbed porcelain until it hummed. She swept the same corridor 3 times because Henrique insisted the grain of dust betrayed intent. Cristina called attention to mistakes with a smile that cut. Dona Gloria covered them with a look that apologized on behalf of a world that could not be kinder. But Dandara was not only patience. In the quiet between tasks, she found rhythm. She would beat a slow pattern against the wooden table while she dried china. A tap here, a whisper of movement in her shoulders when she leaned to polish the banister. She was a dancer with no stage, practicing small rebellions. If music was not offered, she made it from motion. That small, stubborn pulse became a private language. It insulated her the way a sweater keeps out cold. The mansion kept its own noises. Henrique's wheelchair clicked across marble like a metronome. The clocks in different rooms told slightly different times. Each was wound to its own arrogance. At night, when the rest of the household slept with the soft terror of those who must answer the phone in case work calls, Henrique listened to the house and sometimes to his own breath. There were pictures in his private room that Dandara once saw by accident, the kind emotions that did not fit the rest of the place. A photograph clutched with two people who had looked like weather together, eyes smiling, hands in sunlight, evidence that before walls thickened, walls had been thin. There was a first collision. It would have been invisible in any other world, but in Henrique's world, small collisions behave like mines. Dandara had been told to steam a ballroom of drapes at sunrise. The steam iron hissed and produced a smell of hot cloth and steam that rose like white ghosts. Henrique's list was burned into the staff like a liturgy. Details mattered. A sprinkling of perfection that would be noticed by him and, perhaps, by the rest. "You will not ruin the fabric," he said from the doorway of the ballroom, his voice a flat stone thrown across water. He watched without moving his body. The wheelchair remained an island. Dandara's hand stilled. Steam sighed. The light fell from the chandelier like a confession. She met his stare quietly. "I will not," she answered. There was no tremor in the voice he heard. There was, instead, the tired authority of someone who had learned to keep vows without trumpets. Something in him, an old muscle he had not exercised in years, registered the steadiness. He watched the way she smoothed the pleats with long, deliberate passes. He watched the way her thumb lingered on a hem as if testing the memory of someone who wore this cloth in other lives he could not name. Later that day, in the service wing, she heard the names of the women who had left. They were spoken like facts. Their boxes were lined on the back stoop. Dandara bent to pick up a stray ribbon off the floor. The woman who had been fired that morning brushed past, lashes wet enough to leave salt tracks at the edge of her collar. "You have a child?" she asked Dandara suddenly as they packed linens into a bin. She had a softness that had not been permitted for too long. Dandara's fingers paused. "Yes," Dandara said, "Leela is 5. The word made a small, bright thing in her chest, one she had promised to keep warm. "He'll take you if you let him," the woman murmured, meaning Henrique. She made the word like a threat and a prophecy. Dandara did not look up. She had heard that line before, said by others in many different voices. "Take what you can get." She had learned the difference between being taken and choosing. "I do not want to be taken," she said. "I want to work." Word traveled through the house the way it always did, quietly, picked up on the underside of conversation. Henrique noticed, of course. He noticed the way she moved, how she wore a child's drawing folded in her wallet the way an amulet might be hidden. He noticed when she hummed at night to herself while mopping the service stair. A melody's small rebellion can feel like a lie if you are not allowed to hear it. There was a moment in the kitchen when Henrique's stare softened in a way that made people in the house suspect he might be sleeping. He remained awake. He watched Dandara catch her breath before answering a curt instruction. He watched her mouth the time of a pill jar she needed to buy for a child. Cura? No. Survival. The information, small, precise, became a fissure. "Why don't you speak your mind?" he asked from the threshold one rainy afternoon when the house smelled of wet curtains and coffee. Dandara set the cup down slowly. A drop of water trembled on the rim and splashed off. She was careful with gestures. She was even more careful with confessions. "Because when I speak my mind here," she said, "they take what they can from me. They take my time, my energy. They take my hours with my daughter." The words were not blunt as a hammer. They were a map of a life's lack. Henrique's mouth did a motion he had not allowed many to see. An eyebrow lifted, not in surprise, but in a tired, private amusement. "You speak like someone with no leverage." "Leverage doesn't get medicine paid," she answered. "Leverage doesn't buy diapers when the month runs thin. Leverage doesn't stay when you are the only one who can hold a small hand at night." There were reasons why doors had long been closed to the idea of hosting a public event on the property. Henrique had withdrawn from the public for years, preferring walls and spreadsheets over presence and performance. But Dona Elena, older, perhaps softer in some private arithmetic, liked public things the way some people like calling cards, as a way to leave proof that the family existed and had done work. She wanted a benefit, and she wanted it to be a thing that mattered. You cannot mandate grace. You can require spectacle. Her request was both. She moved through the house with an efficient kindness, and when she reached the staff room, she made a decision in front of them that stunned the sleepy, careful world into momentary clarity. "We will hold the benefit," she said. She looked at Henrique as if addressing an old treaty. "And you," she said, eyes sliding to Dandara, "you will perform." A hush settled, not like the hush before applause, but like the hush of people waiting for a verdict. Dandara's heart, which had learned to be economical with its beats, began to miscount. She forced her shoulders down, folded her hands as if to make them smaller. The photograph in her wallet seemed to press against the leather. "Mother," Henrique said from his seat, voice cooler than the tiles, as if he had learned to make everything a business transaction. "Why? There are professionals. We have staff." "You gave me a reason," Dona Elena said. "There will be no excuses. The house will host this. You will make sure it happens." Her words had weight because she wielded power not like a threat but like a law. Henrique's hands, hand-shaped injuries that had learned to keep a world at bay, rested on the arms of his chair. He did not argue in the presence of his mother when she wore certainty. He had been schooled to respect the things that had size. Dona Gloria whispered something to Dandara the way one might hand over a talisman. "Go home and rest," she said. "Practice your rhythm. They've chosen you." Dandara could not hide the way her breath came shallow, hurried. The choice was both a gift and a gauntlet. To perform was to be seen in a way that would make no one in the house comfortable. To refuse would mean returning to a job that swallowed time and gave nothing back. Lila's tuition sat on a small shelf at home like a silent creditor. Back in her tiny apartment that evening, the space returned to its honest plainness. The refrigerator hummed, and the poster of a cartoon she couldn't afford yet hung crooked on the wall because someone had used tape and done what they could. A small voice, a tinny recording of Lila practicing her alphabet, echoed when Dandara opened the door. The child's laugh burst from a phone call she kept by the bedside. Dandara made tea with hands that had been in better water. She reheated a modest dinner. She lay a small drawing under the little lamp. The postcard from Lila's kindergarten had the sun with purple rays and a stick figure that was meant to be Dandara, and she pressed her thumb to the picture and felt the familiar ache that held her upright. This is the part of the story where a soft invitation divides audiences. If stories of courage move you, tap like to support more. It is small, only a click, and like paper in a mailbox, it can make things feel less alone. Dandara did not tell Lila that she had been chosen to perform. The child would have offered up her own little song, the kind of cheer that insists everything is simple when it is not. Instead, Dandara tucked the news into her pocket like a private coin. She practiced alone at night. Her movement was not about spectacle, it was about memory and muscle. She moved because her body remembered songs her heart had almost forgotten. It was not showmanship, it was reclamation. The house prepared too. A ballroom that had not hosted music in years was measured, rehearsed for schedules that had 1,000 leaks. The staff whispered logistics. Christina watched Dandara with a narrowing of the mouth that could have been greed or fear. She had ideas of a future where she might stand where someone else stood. Roberto adjusted his quiet loyalty, seeing in the choice an opening and a hazard. Dona Gloria checked seams and hems and the way velvet fell, the way a stage can take a person and make them larger. Henrique lived in a world where privilege was the only language allowed. Yet the return of his mother and the announcement of a benefit reopened something he had kept closed, the idea of looking. He had not been a spectator in years. He had been the arbiter of lists and the keeper of cold expectations. To see a person move without invitation, that was something he had not planned for. Later that week, after a day of impossible tasks and the slow grinding down that comes from bending to others' needs, Dandara sat in a little back room and laced her fingers together until the knuckles went white. The air had the smell of starch and lemon and something that makes you tired even if you have not worked, residual worry. Donna Gloria brought in a small cup of coffee that was too sweet and set it down like a mend. "You are good," the woman said. Not like a compliment, but as a fact that deserved to be recorded. Dandara looked at her, and for a second the house ceased to be a set of instructions. "I taught myself," she said. "I had to." "You will not be alone out there," Donna Gloria said, and the sentence was more promise than fact, the way a hand can be. The night before the first rehearsal, the house hummed with a low nervousness. Technicians came in, their voices low and professional, talking about mics and light and the small cheating of spotlights that make a person seem to hover. Dandara practiced in the service stair again, slow movements that bled into the wall and made her feel like a secret that was not ready to be revealed. In her bag, the photograph of Leela peered out, the small son smiling. She kissed the paper as if it were a charm and whispered something into empty space, a practice not entirely unlike prayer. Henrique watched from a distance, a quiet man who had long made distance a virtue. He could see her practicing, and he could see the house moving around her in ways that made him uncomfortable. He had not wanted the benefit. He had preferred the minimal friction of his private life, neat and contained. Yet now he found himself offering directions to staff and correcting a lighting technician, small, precise commands that felt like routine until they did not. Somewhere inside him, a muscle, unused and stubborn, shifted. That night he turned to photograph in the privacy of his room. 2 hands caught in sun. An empty space beside it on the nightstand, a ring box he had once touched and then closed. The house had become a mausoleum of choices. He had chosen distance. In choosing it, he had hardened into a person more practiced at punishment than at mercy. Somewhere below the chandeliers and the polished floors, where the house's staff slept in small rooms with thin couches and curtains that kept out the worst of the light, a small radio played a song that Dandara hummed without knowing she would later make it her own. The song was ordinary. It spoke about walking and about taking one step and then another. It was the most ordinary kind of manifesto. A week passed where small things accrued into a sense of impending collision. Henrique's old acquaintances emailed asking about the benefit. His mother ordered invitations. Dandara balanced shifts and rehearsals. Sometimes she slipped into the little music room with a mop and let herself be a person who stretched and reached and let the air move her. Once, when she extended an arm to a note she heard in her head, Henrique watched from the doorway, and for the first time the clenching in his chest loosened a fraction. It was a small mercy he did not know how to hold. Not everyone in the house liked the idea of a staff member standing in the center of light. Christina's eyes glinted with something resentful, something that tasted like fear. "You think you're better than us?" she muttered once, in a corner where the mop buckets kept out of sight. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "No," Dandara said without looking. "I'm trying to be enough." It was not a line for performance. It was a line that existed because sometimes the truth announces itself in a whisper, and you cannot afford to be grand about it. The words fell like something that might flicker a fuse. On the day of the dress rehearsal, Donna Elena arrived early and moved through the rooms with the precision of a seasoned general. She inspected the food table, the arrangement of flowers, white lilies in boxes, and the technicians bowed like a chorus. She began to speak in a voice that made the house listen. "We do this properly," she said. "Henrique, we do it not to show wealth, but to open a door. We must be purposeful." There was a firmness in the statement that made even Henrique a little unsettled. He had the power to shelve things. He had the power to cancel. But his mother carried the kind of force that could reach even him, and she used it. She used it not with malice, but with a sort of righteous impatience, the kind that believes a good name can be shaped by good acts. When she watched Dandara rehearse, something loosened in her face. The woman moved with a modest, dignified power. Her arms were not long enough for grand gestures, and that made them beautiful. She filled the space she was given and then made more. "You will speak to the donors," Dona Helena said, eyes on Dandara. "You will tell them why we must fund this program. We will not let the house's money sit in glass. We will give it where it can change a life." Dandara's breath shortened. The invitation was real and immediate. To be seen in front of men who had written checks that could rewrite the course of neighborhoods was not only terrifying, but also dangerous. It offered the possibility of being used and the possibility of being recognized. She folded both into herself and went home that night with a head full of rhythms and a stomach full of worry. There was a scene that happened in private afterward, small and precise and without fanfare. Henrique found Dandara late in the day when the ballroom had cleared and the house's light took on a patient gold. She was wrapping a scarf around her throat, a cheap thing but warm. He sat a respectful distance away, folding his hands in the way of a man who had learned to make his body a neutral surface. "You don't have to perform for them," he said. "It is the house. They can—" Dandara stood, scarf forgotten, and met him in the quiet. "I am not performing for them," she said. "I am performing because I need to be seen as something other than an extension of the household. I have a daughter to support. I have to be visible for her to know that the world can be something different." Henrique's eyes, cold and then not, fixed on her. "Is that what this is? A plea?" "No." Her voice was small and bright at once. "It's work. It's something I do well." He watched her then, in that moment of stripped intention. The wheelchair's wheels were a soft percussion against the wood. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine someone else picking up a small child from a bedside, singing a song, buying medicine. It was only an image, and it was only for a second, but even seconds are expensive in a house that measures time like currency. "Don't let anyone take advantage of you," he said, and the sentence landed awkwardly. It was intended as protection, but it sounded like instruction. People like Henrique gave orders when they wanted to help. They had learned only one grammar. "I know," she said. "I know what to expect." Break. The private collision had been small. A few words, a shared glance. It was not confession, not apology. It was not even warmth. It was, rather, a crack that allowed light to stab through. Cracks are unpredictable. They can widen. They can start small and, with pressure and the right touch, become something that lets the world in. Dona Helena sat at dinner that night like a woman who had decided the course of history by choosing the right entree. She watched Henrique taste food and then put down his napkin, an almost ritual gesture. The household buzzed with undercurrents as staff prepared the rooms and checked lighting. The house itself seemed to lean forward as if it couldn't wait for the event to begin. There was both anticipation and dread. In the corridor, Dona Gloria found Dandara and took her hand for a brief squeeze, an old woman's benediction. "Be careful," she said, not as a reprimand, but as a prayer given in plain terms. Dandara smiled without showing all of the teeth that might mean triumph. "I will be careful," she promised. She would be careful, because a mother's caution is a craft learned through small, repeated acts. Back in the private wing, Christina plotted with a cold little joy. There were ways to make sure the spotlight moved. There were ways to ensure that mistakes looked like incompetence and not the honest, trembling attempts of a woman who had practiced steps in stairwells. The house had mechanisms for that, old as the first arrangement of rooms. Christina loved the idea of being the one who never fell into the trap of loyalty. She preferred the safety of ambition. But the house had other players. Roberto adjusted suitcases and smoothed ties with a quiet attention that was less about performance than about acknowledgement. He had a way of seeing people, not as objects. He had watched Dandara since she arrived, and, in small actions, he had built a list of favors he might one day offer. The night before the public rehearsal, Dandara sat on the narrow edge of her bed and looked at the photograph of Leela. The child had drawn a big yellow sun and labeled it, "Have a nice day," in shaky letters. The drawing was everything, a promise, an accusation, a prayer. Dandara slid the picture into her back pocket and stood. She rehearsed a phrase she had decided on, not for the donors, but for herself. "I can do this." She practiced walking the invisible line that would separate her from the audience. The next morning, the mansion filled with people who were everything to the house. The potential donors, the old friends, the people who held keys to charity committees. They filled the seats with polite conversations that sounded like music for people whose music required no struggle. Candles and programs were printed. Henrique watched, distant and present, a man who had learned to be both. Dandara went to the wings to warm up. The technicians wrapped her in a wash of light that smelled faintly of ozone and paint. She breathed. Her feet found the floor she had cleaned with her own hands. She thought of Lila's small laugh and felt something like courage push up through her ribs. She would not be alone when she stepped into the light. She would carry 1,000 small things with her. Memories, the weight of the nights she had worked, the sound of Donna Gloria's voice. She would carry the possibility of being recognized as a human being who had the same right to beauty as anyone who wrote checks. Henrique watched from a distance as well, his face a study in reserve. He had spent years measuring people's usefulness. It is hard, in that work, to find the same muscles you need to see them. He had not planned to be present for the rehearsal, but Donna Helena had her ways and had set things in motion as if to correct a ledger he had kept private for too long. They were both in their places, the rich man in his chair and the single mother with a drawing in her pocket. And the house did what houses do. It made their meeting inevitable. They took their places. Light hummed. Air tasted like polished wood and a faint citrus from cleaning solutions. The house leaned forward, expectant. Backstage, Dandara breathed into a small paper cup of water. Her hands did not stop moving. They warmed up like she was making music for someone who needed it more than applause. The sound crew checked levels. A technician with a clipboard murmured into a headset. Donna Gloria smoothed the shawl across Dandara's shoulders as if arranging an armor of ordinary cloth. Roberto stood nearby, his posture a kind of watchful kindness. Christina lingered close enough to be a threat and far enough away to be a spectator. Above them, in a wing roped off with velvet, Henrique watched, fingers on the arms of his chair. He had made the chair a place where distance stuck like varnish. His eyes were set toward the stage, but his face was a map of restraint, practiced neutral, habit of command. Donna Helena sat beside him with a paper program folded in her lap, the sharp letters black on cream. She had the look of someone who had booked storms and weathered them. There was a steadiness to her, less of softness and more of intention, and the steadiness would decide the evening for many. Dandara's phone buzzed. She let it ring once, then twice. On the third ring, she let the screen light up and lifted it. Lila's name filled the display in letters Dandara had watched grow from wobble to careful script. She tapped the speaker and put it against her chest. The child's voice came through, bright and thin with sleep and hope. "Mama, don't forget my lunch," Lila said. For a second, the line snapped the room's thread of rehearsal into a thinner, more honest filament. The little request carried with it the weight of everything Dandara had been carrying for years. "I won't," Dandara whispered. "I'll be back soon." "Okay, I love you." "I love you more," Dandara said, voice steady. Lila answered with a noise that was almost a giggle. Then Dandara slid the phone into her pocket and closed the small, private world of the conversation in the same way she had folded linens for the mansion, neatly, without fanfare. The first performance was not a novelty to the donors. They watched as if they had been invited to confirm their own worth by being present. Glass clinked. Programs were opened like little maps to an evening of reassurance. Yet, when the lights hit the stage and Dandara stepped into the center, something unaccountable moved across the room. People lean into light because they believe it belongs to them. That night, light found someone who had not expected it. She began simply, feet rooted, arms curved like questions. The silence that had awaited her trembled and then folded into the rhythm she kept in her chest. Her movement was a conversation in an old language. It was not showy because it did not need to be. It needed to be true. Henrique watched and felt the rip in the old calculations he had made. The distance he had cultivated for his own comfort was an archive of small cruelties. Watching Dandara reclaim space was like watching a ledger balance in a way that made him uneasy. Under the skin of his restraint, something itched. The stage had been rigged with a string of recorded tracks and a small live ensemble tucked to one side. The technicians had scheduled cues with the precision of a jeweler. But houses hold histories, and histories keep secrets. Somewhere between a microphone check and the hush before applause, a wire came loose. A cable that matched the wrong label had been shifted in the chaos of a last-minute run-through. The soundboard read silence. It should have been a small thing, a thing fixable in a breath. But in the narrow bureaucracy of the house, it was an opportunity. Christina had been there when the cable had been unplugged. She had lingered near equipment with a hand that trembled because fear makes people reckless. When the house stilled and the music failed to fill the room, her face was the exact shape of a vindication that tasted bitter even to her. The first note was swallowed. A sliver of air crawled through the hall. Dandara paused as if the quiet were a thing she could adjust to. The audience shifted, the noise of coughs and the brush of chairs. Henrique's face tightened. A technician yelped into his headset and then moved like oil spilled on a tile, urgent, apologetic. A light technician cursed quietly and went under the stage to examine a spliced connection. The stage had been rigged with silence. It should have been a small thing, a thing fixable in a breath. But in the narrow bureaucracy of the house, it was an opportunity. Christina had been there when the cable had been unplugged. She had lingered near equipment with a hand that trembled because fear makes people reckless. When the house stilled and the music failed to fill the room, her face was the exact shape of a vindication that tasted bitter even to her. The first note was swallowed. A sliver of air crawled through the hall. Dandara paused as if the quiet were a thing she could adjust to. The audience shifted, the noise of coughs and the brush of chairs. Henrique's face tightened. A technician yelped into his headset and then moved like oil spilled on a tile, urgent, apologetic. A light technician cursed quietly and went under the stage to examine a spliced connection. Dandara did not step back. She could have. She could have let the light become a question that made her invisible again. But the rhythms she had kept to herself had long been stronger than that. She began instead to use what she had: the wood of the stage, the quiet of the room, her own breath. She tapped her foot in a pattern. The sound of heel on floor made a small metronome. The pattern grew as she added a clap with her hands. A beat found an edge. Her shoulders answered. A ripple moved through her. Slowly, like a river finding a new channel, the hall filled with a movement that did not require recorded music. Her body generated the music. Her hands braided the silence into a language the audience could understand because it was human. Henrique saw it with a clarity that made his throat constrict. The sound he had expected, an orchestrated, controlled product, had been replaced by something elemental. The hush turned into attention. Donors leaned in as if listening to someone tell a story that marked them. The clapping rhythm grew, and a few seats began to meld into hands tapping quietly along. Backstage, a flurry. Technicians whispering, the head of sound gesturing. It would have been a frantic scramble in most houses. Roberto stood ready to fetch a spare cable. Christina, who had sat back with a smirk that tasted like victory, froze when she saw the room shift. For a moment, she was both small and enormous, the kind of contradiction that can burn a person. The improvisation drew the house into an intimacy that had not been planned. Dandara walked the space as if it were an old room in a small apartment, warm, known. She kept moving, eyes wide with that fierce concentration she used when balancing a child on her hip or counting pills at midnight. The audience surrendered to the momentum. Someone at the back began to hum on the rhythm she had made with her feet. It spread. And then she saw him. Henrique had been watching from his chair, a man used to being looked at rather than looking. For the first time since his accident, his eyes were not authority. They were raw. There was a fissure that had nothing to do with instructions or lists. It had to do with watching someone risk being seen. He met her gaze and her feet managed a step closer. She could have performed from her height, the stage's safe elevation. Instead, she walked down the steps and toward his chair. The house seemed to slow at that moment. The chandelier's light, the scrape of a chair leg in the back, the small breath people held. She stood before his wheelchair and did what she had been practicing all the nights she had warmed the stairwell with movement. She reached. Close up, her hand hovered, then touched his knuckles. The world shrank to the two of them. The motion of a single human touch against metal and skin and scar. Henrique's fingers, which had learned to hold a world away, loosened by millimeters. The breath that escaped him was a small concession. Dandara bent her head, and the whisper that had been kept like a coin in her pocket rolled out, small and precise, "You are enough." It was softer than the chandelier's tinkle and stronger than the applause that had waited for a cue. It landed on him not as a command, but as recognition. The phrase was not a promise of cure or of absolution. It was a truth she had built from the quiet work of keeping a child fed and school fees paid, from the nights she had practiced steps beneath humming fluorescence. It was a declaration without judgment. Henrique's face failed him then. All the careful construction of armor, the lists and the strategic coldness, the habit of making people smaller so he could measure them, those defenses collapsed in a way the house had not expected. He exhaled, and the sound was a cracked thing like ice moving in a river. Tears came first, wet and sudden, and then his shoulders shook. It was a breakdown that was not a spectacle of weakness, but of humanity being reclaimed. The audience saw some of what was happening. The hush that followed was heavier than any prepared silence. People who had come to be seen as charitable sat as if in the presence of something true. Donors had envelopes and clutches and an easy confidence that required no risk. That evening, they had been asked, without any program note, to witness a person erupt into life. Henrique's voice, when it found a way through the tears, did not have the cadence of orders. It had the rough texture of someone who had been misused by his own grief. I am sorry," he said. The words landed in the ballroom like stones tossed into an old pond. He did not explain. He simply allowed the apology to be what it was, immediate and incomplete. Dona Helena's expression was not triumph. It was a mix of admonition and relief. The woman had engineered a moment not because she desired a scene, but because she wanted an opening. She let the opening remain ajar. Dandara stepped back onto the stage, a slight smile, humble, stunned, across her face. The audience began to clap, slowly at first, then with a wave that filled the room. The applause was not the thing that saved them. It was the sound of people recognizing the cost of courage. It roared like tidewater. Afterward, in the hush of the corridors, people spoke in little clusters. Some said things that sounded like plans. Some said things that sounded like condolences. Christina stood with a face like a ledger that had suddenly read negative. The choices she had made, small, petty, meant to protect her place, had shaded the night. She looked at Roberto, who had seen the hand she had used, at Dona Gloria, who had known long before many in the room what a small kindness could cost. Henrique did a thing that astonished more than the tears. He left his chair with help. Not to walk across the room, no miraculous march, but to lean on a pair of arms and stand, supported and unsteady. He remained the size of his wounds, but he opened his chest in a way he had not done in years. The movement signaled more than physical strain. It signaled intention. In a private sitting room later that evening, the mansion emptying of guests, Henrique and Dona Helena, Dandara and Dona Gloria sat in a circle that had the shape of an excused truth. Henrique's hands waved like someone trying to collect the edges of his own life. "I have been cruel," he said. He did not make an appeal to excuses. He named the shape of his own wrong. Naming was the first small repair. Dandara listened. She held out no moral high ground. She had given him words that night, not judgment. Her life had taught her the economy of mercy. When she replied, she did not ask for the world. She only asked for fairness, for the dignity she had carried like a suitcase in the cold. "You can be kinder," she said, "and you can give people real chances, not charity, chances." Henrique looked at her as if counting coins in his head, but differently. His mind began to tally the unfamiliar ledger of human exchange, where recognition earns more than a tax receipt. "What would you have me do?" he asked. It was, fundamentally, a question that required him to move. Dona Helena, who had been watching the entire night as if assembling a plan, took a breath and laid one that had the force of a signature. "We will start a program," she said. "A school. We will fund training. We will open the house to the neighborhood in a way that bears fruit beyond our guest lists." The idea sounded radical in a home that measured its legacy in maintenance budgets and portraits. But the suggestion had the practical bones of a plan. Scholarships for youth, weekly classes for local children in arts and dance, paid apprenticeships for staff who wanted to train, a seed fund that would pay teachers and rent. Henrique sat very still and then nodded. The motion did not fix everything. It allowed a new project, a concrete step toward making the kindness that had been spoken that night institutional rather than performative. That commitment changed the house in subtle ways over the next weeks. Papers were drafted. Meetings were held in rooms that smelled of espresso and old decisions. Donors received handwritten notes. Henrique visited with physiotherapists and trusted doctors who sat at his dining table with diagrams and realistic plans. A regimen of therapy, pain management, a schedule of appointments, and small, measurable goals. Progress would come in degrees, seconds of unsupported standing, steps with a walker and a therapist's steady hand. Not miraculous, not instant, real. Dandara received an offer that unfolded slowly, The program proposed not only to fund training, but to hire instructors, paid positions targeted to people from neighborhoods like hers. Henrique's commitment included funding for Lila's tuition, the surprise that repaired some of the edges of nights filled with worry. It included a paid position for Dandara, to teach community classes and to run an apprenticeship program for women who had been staff. It was not charity, it was work with dignity. She accepted, not because the house had absolved her of previous suffering, but because the offer granted something rarer than money, recognition that her labor as a dancer had value beyond the invisible tasks done for the house. For the first time, she would be paid for the things she loved and would be offered time to teach others to hold space for themselves. Christina's small sabotage was not ignored. The technical team traced the unplugged cable and confronted her. She admitted it without drama, not to dramatize guilt, but because consequences in places like that are practical things: reductions in privilege, reassignment of duties, and admonition she could not dismiss. There was no theatrical exile. She was offered other positions in the new program, choices that demanded humility. Some nights she left without sleep. Some mornings she came to the studio and watched as hands that had been turned away were lifted. Her arc was not clean. She flattered and pushed, and sometimes she softened. She would remain a person in the story, not a parable. The work of institutionalizing mercy was messy. There were meetings where voices raised. There were donors who wanted names embossed on plaques and others who wanted the program to remain low-key. There were neighbors who came with pent-up hope and some skepticism. The staff rearranged schedules. Classes began in rooms with big windows and slightly warped floors that had once only hosted gatherings for the comfortable. Children arrived with sneakers and uncertain pride. Dandara taught the first class with hands that trembled from nerves and the steady patience of someone used to small, exacting practice. The community responded. A boy who had never been asked to move as anything but chaos found a cadence in Dandara's exercises, and then, after weeks of practice, stood in front of his mother and held a line for 30 seconds. A woman who had thought age an enemy discovered a posture that made her shoulders less like shields and more like music stands. They were small wins that multiplied like seeds. Henrique did his work too. Physiotherapy was grueling and repetitive in ways that made anyone who watched it wonder at the courage it takes to fight your own body. He sat through appointments with a stubbornness that felt like pride learning a new grammar. There were days when his legs felt like strangers, and nights when he left the clinic exhausted and bone-weary. He had to relearn the skill of patience with himself. He did not always do it well. He received a therapist named Miguel who insisted on measurable objectives. 15 seconds of standing without support, then 20, then a few assisted steps. Each small victory had to be recorded and celebrated without hyperbole. They were increments, no miracles promised, only the slow arithmetic of persistence. Public relations people tried to frame the story in tidy headlines. They wanted an easy narrative: fallen man redeemed by a servant's kindness. Dandara refused scripts that refused her to an instrument for someone else's public confession. She insisted on language that honored both her work and her dignity. "This is not about one person saving another," she said in an interview she agreed to with a community journal. "It's about building opportunities." Months turned like notes in a long piece of music. The Institute opened its doors in a former banquet room converted into studio space with mirrored walls and padded floors. The sign above the doors read simply, "The Lila Center." Henrique had not insisted on a name that glorified his family. It was Donna Helena who suggested honoring the future, and Henrique who accepted the modesty of it. The name referenced the child who had been central to the story without making the house a shrine to self-satisfaction. There were donors' plaques in the lobby, but more important were the keys handed to a group of teens who lived on bus routes that had once been barriers. The ribbon cutting was a humble thing. Children held one end of the ribbon and teachers the other. Dandara stood in the center, a woman with a small constellation of experience around her. The nights of practice, the shifts that had taught her economy, Lila's drawings in a frame at the back of the studio. Henrique watched from a short distance. He did not stand on a dais. He stood with a cane nearby and a therapist at his elbow who had the air of someone tired but quiet with competence. When the ribbon fell away, applause erupted, in a way that meant something practical. Doors would open, classes would be scheduled, funds would be dispersed. There were smiles and a few tears. Lila, who had not attended the event, had left a drawing for the center that was framed and placed in the reception. It was a sun with purple rays and a crooked house. Dandara touched the frame as if it were a talisman and then walked to the floor where practice began. Life did not resolve into an eternal arc of easy victories. Henrique would not become someone untouched by his past. Some days he came to the center and watched and could barely make the step down from the porch. Other days he stood, supported by a therapist and by a walker, and managed a few steps to the studio's threshold. The first time he stood unsupported for 20 seconds, the people in the room did not explode into theatrics. They stood and nodded. They offered quiet congratulations and then returned to the work that mattered: teaching, training, paying salaries. Dandara taught young mothers how to hold their centers. She taught kids how to step into rhythm. She showed a teenager how to move a hip in a way that suggested confidence. She did administrative work as well: schedules, grant applications, connecting with neighborhood schools. The job paid her and gave Lila a stable school. The work returned to her something she had not allowed herself to keep: time with her child that was not carved into minutes stolen from shifts. Sometimes she would pick up Lila from school, and the girl would run into her arms with a triumph that made the house of her past life shrink into a humble shape. Henrique's presence at the center was complex. He attended a few classes, not to lead, but to observe. He donated funds under terms arranged by Donna Helena and Dandara. They insisted on oversight and transparency. Money would be respectable and accountable, not a public vanity project. He volunteered once a month to help with logistics, folding programs, setting chairs, offering a check-in call to families in crisis. He had awkward conversations with staff where he asked about wages and about fairness. These conversations were sometimes stilted and sometimes useful. He had to learn what it meant to be accountable in a new register, not by force, but by sustained, boring consistency. Months after the night Dandara had whispered 3 words, there were scenes small enough to be easily overlooked that showed real change. Henrique managed to stand for 30 seconds without assistance, and then, with the aid of a walker and the careful guidance of Miguel the therapist, put 2 steps together. It was not cinematic. It was an unsettling, humbling exercise in patience. Dandara stood nearby and clapped, not like a maid assisting royalty, but like a colleague cheering a peer's small progress. On a late autumn afternoon, a group of children from a nearby public school filed into the studio for a workshop. One boy, who had been reluctant at first to remove his jacket, took a place on the floor and watched Dandara as if she held a secret. She asked him to close his eyes and feel the floor beneath him. He trembled and then steadied. Afterward, he looked up at Henrique, who had been watching from the doorway, and mouthed a hesitant "thank you," which Dandara accepted without the need for grand gestures. The exchange was compact, private, a man learning to be human again, and a woman whose life had shifted from survival to stewardship. Christina's arc continued in shades of human complexity. She had been moved to a position in the program where she could teach logistics and client relations, skills she had used defensively for years in the mansion. The change did not erase her past pettiness, but it gave her a place where she could see other people's need and, occasionally, respond with something like empathy. There were slips. She would sometimes revert to old habits, but the program's structure contained them and offered correction. People at the center liked to say that no one was redeemed by a single act. They were transformed by continued practice. There was no trumpeted return to mobility for Henrique. There were quiet achievements inside clinicians' notes: a 10% increase in core strength, an extra 5 steps with a walker, an ability to stand and pour a cup of tea without assistance. Each of these small victories was filed and celebrated, not as miracles, but as increments. He learned to accept the slow arithmetic. That learning was perhaps the most radical change. The shift from expecting immediate results to embracing the work of gradual repair. The house itself softened in the practical sense. Where once only polished marble testified to status, pieces of community art appeared on walls. There were photographs of classes and murals painted by children in the foyer. Staff rooms were improved, small things like new mattresses and proper heating. The changes did not erase inequality, but they threaded the mansion to the neighborhood in new, less extractive ways. For Dandara, life held new pressures that were different but familiar. The day she signed the contract to be a paid instructor, she felt an odd tug. The relief of a secured salary mixed with the sudden weight of responsibility. She became, in one role, a manager and a teacher, and still a mother who sorted lunches and homework. She bore the ordinary fatigue of someone who loved her job and found it demanding. There were scenes where she sat late at night in the studio, lamp on, filling out grant proposals and budgeting for after-school snacks. Lila lay on the couch with a book, the drawing she had given the center at the opening framed on the wall. The child's presence kept Dandara honest. She refused offers that would make her forget why she had fought for dignity in the first place. Over time, Henrique began to change not only in movement but in habit. He visited the center more often. He learned MAMES. He listened in meetings where his role was advisory and not compulsory. He learned to let others correct him, a small but difficult art. Once, in a board meeting, a young teacher criticized one of his proposed allocations as impractical. He listened and then asked questions, not like a man defending his ego, but like someone curious about someone else's expertise. People noticed the difference and adjusted their expectations. Change would be slow, not flashy. The Lila Center expanded to offer scholarships for teenage dancers and a mentorship program pairing professionals with beginners. It began to host small recitals where children who had been taught by Dandara performed. The recitals were not grand productions. They were honest and imperfect and more moving because of it. Parents cried sometimes. The children clapped each other's hands and learned what applause felt like. Each recital was a small testimony to the fact that work had consequences that went beyond a happy headline. One winter evening, Henrique walked into the studio with a cane and without the usual cushion of staff at his side. He had come to watch a rehearsal and had chosen, not theatrically, but intentionally, to stand at the edge of the room. Dandara was leading a class when she saw him, and paused as if to acknowledge something private. After the session, he approached the group and did a thing that belonged to the new ledger he had been learning. He asked the children about their dreams. He sat on a folding chair, no fanfare, and listened as they spoke about scholarships and opening nights and, improbably, colleges. Days later, a small group of donors who had attended the first benefit came to tour the center. They had been moved by the night Dandara had improvised. They had seen a man break down and thought themselves absolved because they had clapped. Now they were invited to do the harder thing: fund sustainable programs. Their contributions helped pay for a scholarship fund and for a part-time physical therapist to work with local youth. The money was not a magic tonic. It was leverage to pay teachers and keep doors open. One afternoon, Henrique and Dandara sat on a bench outside the studio after a session where a teenage boy had made a breakthrough. The air had the smell of wet pavement and paint. Henrique's hands curled around a mug. He looked at Dandara as if measuring the distance of a bridge he'd been too afraid to cross before. "You were brave," he said simply. "No theatrics, no grand speech, just an observation." Dandara shrugged in a way that was almost modest. "It felt necessary," she said. "I had to make sure my daughter saw that." They spoke of practicalities after that: scheduling, funding, curriculum. Dona Helena sometimes sat in. Dona Gloria visited frequently and kept everyone honest. Roberto popped in and out like an informal family member, bringing a small kindness with him. The center took on the feel of a slow experiment in how institutions could be retooled to do good instead of merely host it. As the first year of the center's life closed, the board, composed now of staff members, community representatives, and a few donors, met to evaluate progress. They read reports. They heard testimonies from parents who said their children had become more confident. They heard from a young teacher who had gained employment and began a night course in pedagogy. They discussed sustainability, and they voted on a small stipend program for staff continuing education. The meeting was hardly dramatic, but the votes meant more than a press release ever could. On the anniversary of the benefit, Henrique asked Dandara to join him for tea in a modest room away from the main house. There were no cameras, no publicity people, only soft light and the smell of tea. He had been keeping a notebook of goals, small marks that a therapist had suggested. He opened it and showed her a list: 15 seconds, 30 seconds, first assisted steps. The list had been crossed and recrossed. It was unglamorous, precise, and deeply human. "I owe you an apology that isn't just words," he said. "And I owe the people here real, meaningful work." Dandara placed her hand on his notebook and then on his wrist, the same gesture she had made months before at the mansion. The touch was no longer a one-off. It was part of a pattern. He had begun to show up. "You did something too," she said. "You made a choice." He exhaled, a smaller sound than before. "And I will keep making choices," he answered, "for a long time." That admission did not solve all problems. There were days when old habits surfaced and frustration flared. There were moments when staff argued about scheduling or about where to spend money. But the core reality had shifted. The mansion, which had been a machine for preserving distance, had become a site of labor devoted to fostering connection. It was messy, it was real. In time, more windows opened. A local school partnered with the center to include dance in an after-school program. A local clinic offered workshops on posture and health for parents. Henrique's rehabilitation, measured in clinical progress, continued slowly. His body remained limited in ways that would not disappear. Yet he stood more often. He was teaching himself, with the help of therapists and a community that kept him honest, how to live within the boundaries of his own vulnerability. The final image that lingered in the months that followed was not a single cinematic moment, but a series of small frames that together told of a life gently rearranging. Dandara teaching a child to step with confidence. Henrique folding programs quietly before a recital. Dona Gloria pinning a costume with the concentration of a midwife. Roberto adjusting the studio lights without fuss. A group photo of staff and students, messy and smiling. Leela, now a little more confident, walked into the center and drew a new sun that looked less like a plea and more like a map. On a gray morning in the center's modest courtyard, Henrique and Dandara walked a short circle together. He leaned on a cane, then on her arm for balance, a voluntary, reciprocal support. There was none of the old hierarchy. They passed a mural painted by children, bright colors, a dancing figure at the center, words stenciled beneath it: "You are enough." Letters imperfect but earnest. Henrique paused and touched the sentence as if to confirm it was real. Dandara watched him, not with the relief of having saved someone, but with the quiet pride of someone who had stood and then built. At the yearly recital, Dandara watched as the program opened to a page where donors were thanked and students were listed. Children performed with small, unpracticed excellence. The audience clapped in a way that felt earned. At the end of the program, Henrique stood and addressed the room, not to collect praise, but to commit. He spoke about accountability and about structure. He spoke about the need for continued funding and for oversight. He promised to keep showing up to meetings and to maintain the transparent ledger that the program required. The speech was not perfect. It was honest. When the recital ended, people drifted into the courtyard for tea and warm conversations. Dandara stood near the doorway as parents gathered their children. A young woman who had once worked in the mansion approached, eyes bright with an invitation and gratitude. She put a small drawing into Dandara's hand, child's crayons scribbled into a sun, and then ran back to her family. Henrique came up behind Dandara and did what the years of pain had taught him to do in a new register. He offered a hand. She took it. The touch was slight and not symbolic in an easy sense. It was like two people who had been strangers and then came to be companions in a shared project, holding on to keep balance. People noticed the gesture because it carried weight and because it was not the showy cleavage of a redemption story for tabloids. It was, instead, the ordinary intimacy of a community learning to hold itself. Later, as the day waned and the center emptied, Dandara sat with Leela on her lap and watched the final chairs being stacked. The girl's head rested on her shoulder. Above them, the mural still bore its imperfect declaration, "You are enough." Dandara's own breath slowed. She had not received wealth that dissolved all worries. She had not been entitled to a new life without effort. She had, however, been offered the dignity of work that matched her skill and the space to teach others. Henrique went back to his therapy the next week with a modest new goal: 10 more steps with the walker. The therapist scheduled sessions. He returned to the center the following month and watched as a new cohort began classes. He did not stand at the front as a savior, but as a man who had begun to reshape how he spent his time. There were hard conversations involving fairness, pay, outreach, and there were moments of joy that could not be reduced to numbers. A child who learned to lead a warm-up, a teacher who was paid enough to keep studying, donations that paid for a van to bring students from neighborhoods that had been unreachable. The story that began with 3 women packed into boxes and a small drawing in a wallet ended not with a perfect epiphany, but with the ordinary labor of building something that might outlast the fragile moment of a tear. The house, once a monument to distance, had begun, awkwardly and insistently, to function as a place where people were invited to show up, to teach, to be taught. At the center's second anniversary gathering, Dandara stood and looked around. She thought of every night she had practiced alone, of the phone calls whispering reminders about medicine and lunches, of the way a child's drawing had sat like a promise in her wallet. She thought of the 3 words she had whispered in a chair once, words that landed like a small pebble in a still pond, but made a circle that reached shore. She did not seek applause that day. She accepted a bouquet of daisies from a parent and a framed letter of thanks from Dona Helena. Henrique approached with a certificate, the kind of small civic recognition the board had voted on. He handed it to her with hands that had learned to make steady motions again. They both smiled, not broadly, but in the way people who had weathered storms smile, resealed, wary, grateful. "You kept your promise," he said quietly. "You kept some of yours," she replied. They both laughed, the sound soft and unpracticed. It was not a tidy reconciliation. It was a covenant of continued work. The final scene the center liked to return to in a montage was mundane and full of meaning. Children filing into the studio with backpacks, Dandara greeting parents at the door, staff correcting a line in a grant application, Henrique taking a brief step with a walker before sitting down to fold programs. It was an ordinary choreography of repair. In that collage of days, the whisper, "You are enough," did not act as a miracle cure. It had been a pivot, an intimate recognition that cracked the brittle armor of a man practiced in protecting himself with distance. What followed was not a single act of salvation, but a long series of choices. The whisper became a seed when matched with real work. Policies changed, salaries adjusted, therapy scheduled, classes paid for. Both people, Dandara and Henrique, changed because they kept showing up. On a quiet morning months later, Dandara stood in the studio doorway and watched young dancers move through a warm-up she had once taught with fingers that remembered calluses. Her bag hung over a shoulder like a second skin. Leela's drawing, worn at the edges from being carried about, sat on the notice board. Henrique rolled by on his way to a board meeting. The cane clinked soft on the floor, and he paused to offer a nod. She nodded back. No flair, no rhetoric, just a shared, steadying human rhythm. If anyone asked what happened, the answer would be boring and beautiful at once. A woman refused to be diminished. A man accepted the sharpness of being seen. A family invested in the hard work of repair, not spectacle. The effect had nothing to do with a single night, and everything to do with the months and years of work that followed. The mansion became, in small and large ways, a place that moved outward to meet others instead of inward to preserve a comfort that cost other people their dignity. There are no neat endings to such stories. There are instead continuations. The center still needs funds. Henrique still has therapy. Staff still argue about schedules. Christina still sometimes glances back at old patterns. But there is also a clear line. The house stopped being a machine for polishing away human discomfort and began to be a machine for producing something better. In the courtyard at dusk, as children left with scarves and mothers tucked in their arms, Dandara tucked Leela's mitten into the small pocket of the girl's jacket. Henrique rolled by on his way to a board meeting. The cane clinked soft on the floor, and he paused to offer a nod. She nodded back. No flair, no rhetoric. Just a shared, steadying human rhythm. If anyone asked what happened, the answer would be boring and beautiful at once. A woman refused to be diminished. A man accepted the sharpness of being seen. A family invested in the hard work of repair, not spectacle. The effect had nothing to do with a single night, and everything to do with the months and years of work that followed. The mansion became, in small and large ways, a place that moved outward to meet others instead of inward to preserve a comfort that cost other people their dignity. There are no neat endings to such stories. There are instead continuations. The center still needs funds. Henrique still has therapy. Staff still argue about schedules. Christina still sometimes glances back at old patterns. But there is also a clear line. The house stopped being a machine for polishing away human discomfort and began to be a machine for producing something better. In the courtyard at dusk, as children left with scarves and mothers tucked in their arms, Dandara tucked Leela's mitten into the small pocket of the girl's jacket. Henrique rolled by on his way to a board meeting. The cane clinked soft on the floor, and he paused to offer a nod. She nodded back. No flair, no rhetoric. Just a shared, steadying human rhythm. She kissed her forehead and watched the child run to a waiting neighbor. She inhaled the cool air and felt the calm that comes after work that has meaning. Henrique passed by and paused, touched the mural where the phrase, "You are enough," still radiated in imperfect paint. He looked at Dandara, who stood with hands full of soft evidence. Receipts, schedules, the small proof of a life now tethered to a purpose. "You kept your promise," he said again, more gently this time. "So did you," she answered. They did not make a show of it. They did the sustained work of it. The center lights blinked on. A rehearsal began. The house hummed now with a new kind of sound, the sound of people learning together, failing sometimes, then trying again. It was not the hush of marble and distance, but the human noise of a community in motion. If this story reaches you, know that the small acts matter. Speak kindly when someone is collapsed. Offer real chances, not performative ones. And when you meet someone who looks unfixable, try standing with them. The whisper that broke a man was not magic. It was a human recognition that compelled him to remember how to be human again. And then it met work. Share this story with someone who needs to hear those 3 words. Comment below with a small victory of your own. 1 sentence, 1 moment, so we can keep remembering how change really happens. Slowly, insistently, together.